All right, y'all. So finally to the meat and potatoes of this little playlist. I normally start out in a MySQL walkthrough where we begin scaffolding out our schema and talking about that first. But considering this has been focused on the boilerplate from the previous video, I might as well continue that. We're going to focus on the server first thing and foremost, and we're going to talk about structuring out some folders here in our server. Even if we don't fill them out quite yet, I'll talk about why I like to set it up this way. We want to make sure our code is fairly scalable. We want to make sure it's fairly modular. We don't want to code one routes file that has like 5,000 lines of code with every single one of your routes inside of it. Could you? Sure. Should you? Probably not. Instead, we want to make sure that we have a folder layout that can scale horizontally pretty easily. We can just add more files, the more features and utilities and things like that we build out as we need them. So, I mean, starting out with this is a fresh boilerplate clone. I called it Stack It Up because that's one of my favorite chants from my favorite player from Smash Melee back in the day. And, it's going to be building a really simple to-do list application, kind of like my little jQuery demo did from a few weeks ago. And we're just going to be going through our Express code and kind of just building it up the way I like to build it up. So, without further ado, let's get going, I guess. So a lot of the times in my server.ts, when I first start, I like to have some logging going on in my, server logs. So I'm going to go ahead and npm install Morgan and @typings for Morgan. It's one of my favorite Express middlewares that will log nice information about incoming requests. I think I talked about it in that previous video series as well. So with that imported, I need to import that. So I'll go ahead and import Morgan from Morgan right there. What I'll go ahead and do as well is typically provide it somewhere near the top of my middlewares list. That way it will log all incoming requests and not certain ones to certain locations. You can always move it around when you want it to log certain things. This serves our static website, our index.html, which has all of our React code attached to it. If you're going to be passing any kind of JSON bodies, do not forget here, like I did once before, this express.json middleware to make sure we can parse those request bodies coming in. I'm going to change this from API router down to just routes. I think that's a better name once we start building a bigger and stronger application. So we're going to change that variable name to routes. And we're not going to provide a path here. I'm going to let my routes folder, when I get there, actually scaffold that out for me. We have our nice little console log message here. And we probably want to do this next tidbit here. So this little bit right here. Hold on. There we go. It's meant to be kind of like a catch. Now, there's better ways to write this, but this is the simplest and most kind of hacky solution I can think of for my students to learn from first. This little wildcard operator essentially is going to act as, hey, was the route matched inside of this routes variable, which at the moment is only /API/hello. If that is not a GET request to this path, then it's going to pop back out here and go, okay, what do I do? And if it doesn't match anything else, then Express is pre-coded to send some kind of response. But as y'all have known from TypeScript Chirper, you have a front-end set of routes with React Router DOM and a back-end set of routes with Express and the API routes. So this little tidbit here is meant to allow us to do both front-end routing and back-end routing without incurring any issues. So honestly, I'm gonna code this out and we're gonna talk more about it when I do actually scaffold out some basic routes in the front end, and I'll show you what it means. But for now, we're gonna say if it doesn't start with API and get matched inside of there, this GET request should get caught, and we're gonna assume it's gonna be a front-end thing. So we're gonna tell, hey Express, stop interrupting our website's route process and let React Router DOM do its job, unless it begins with API or something on our server. So this is something I always just out of habit add to my server.ts for these boilerplates, but it'll get easier for y'all to understand what it is when I actually get to the front end part. But for now, maybe add it in here and maybe you'll realize it was one of the pieces of code you were missing to allow client-side routing. So I'm going to go ahead and import and use the path module from Node. I'm going to say, hey, do a path.join of _dir name, and we're going to go up one into public index.html, and that should be enough. And we can ES6 shorthand down this quite monstrously by just moving everything onto one line with no curly braces, and voila. Okay, so you might be wondering, why is it only one set of up1 directory, not two? Because, hey, buddy, you're inside of server, which is inside of source, which is then founding public. Why is it only one set of dots? That's because, remember, our code from our boilerplate video is not actually running node or nodemon on our server TS. It's instead being compiled and bundled and outputted to dist server.js, and that's where nodemon actually runs our server. So from this file, it is up1 out of dist and into public directly, and that's why it's only one set of dots and not two, a little caveat that my students always fall for. Okay, so this is typically the basics of the Express server. I code out right here, and then I like to begin to scaffold out the folders in my routes folder and other things like that. So what I'm going to do here is in my server folder, I'm going to make a routes folder. I'm actually going to come into this routes file and copy its inner code, and we're going to delete that file. Again, we don't want one routes file, we want a routes folder that allows us to scale by adding more and more and more endpoints with an individual file. So inside of the routes folder, bear with me, I'm going to set up one other folder called API. In the future, when we start talking about authentication, I'm going to have a separate folder to challenge y'all on routing tricks by having several folders with several index files. So I'm going to need two index files, one inside of the routes folder itself and one inside of the API folder. So in the routes folder, I want an index.ts, and in the API folder, I want an index.ts. Okay, so let's start, and then inside the API folder, I'm going to want finally that todos.ts, the endpoint file for the particular resource in this to-do application. I know we don't have any database stuff set up yet, but I figured we start actually something here in the server side of stuff and then connect the database and switch between the two between the videos. So this is basically setting up the basic scaffolding of what our routes are going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that code that I had a moment ago. What we're going to do is simply change it down to a root request right there that's going to represent all our to-dos. If I get this response successfully in Postman, I then know exactly how I can get to this particular route endpoint. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the index, and this is going to be called our to-dos router, this code we're looking at right here. So I'm going to go to the index. So this is now API index, and we're going to make a router that uses that to-dos router. So what we're going to do is import the to-dos router from the to-dos endpoint file. Of course, Discord's blowing up now. Router.use on the path of /todos, use the logic in the to-dos router. So now I have to-dos and that get request linked up to get all my to-do items when we actually begin building the database out. So that's fine and dandy. This is fine and dandy, but now this API index needs to get indexed in the general routes index. So bear with me, paste yet another router. We'll go ahead and just change this to a.use. We're going to say import the API router from the API directory, and on the path of API, use the logic of the API router. And now that this routes file index is done, our server.ts imports all routes, API and otherwise, from the routes folder. And the routes folder will have all other routes indexed in its index file. That's why we're not going to apply that API path out here. Now, this seems kind of overkill for something so simple right now, and we're building with the future in mind. So this is a little additional challenge for y'all that typically have been coding everything in one routes file. Don't do that. We're going to challenge ourselves and stack it up, these routes, as best as we can. So the whole app uses currently /API. If it's not matched by that, this will catch it and send our home page as a default response. Again, that'll make more sense down the line. But for now, we have no path. It should match in there. The routes index path will match API. Then our to-dos path and our API router will match that part. And then finally, our root path get request should respond with an all to-dos item. I'm going to come back here into my console. I'm going to go ahead and start my server with npm run dev. It'll take a second here for Webpack to compile and bundle and output everything. When you see this style output with localhost 3000 running, you are safe to test it out. It's a GET request, so I could just test it in the browser, but what I'm actually going to do is boot up Postman, and we're going to build a new collection for this particular walkthrough series we're making here, yeah? So, here we go. Looks like this is the same to-dos routers I was building out in my previous YouTube walkthrough. We're going to rebuild these suckers, and we're actually going to save them into something called a collection. That way we can share our collections with our friends and other developers that want to test our code in Postman, going, hey, do you have a collection you can share with me? You can export these as a JSON file, give it to other developers on your project team, and they can also spool up the same tests in their Postman to see what they're doing wrong on their end. So we're going to make a new collection, and we're going to rename it to to-dos full stack. That's technically what I'm building here. So, okay. To-dos full stack. Hooray! I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Oh, I guess I can't, or it's not working. Okay. I'll see how it is. We're going to open up a new request window here. It's going to be a GET request to localhost 3000 / and we'll do API / to-dos, and there is our expected response. Now that I know that this GET request is correctly pathed, it doesn't have any additional authorization or bodies attached to it or anything like that, I'm going to go ahead and just save this thing. I'm going to go ahead and save it and say request name will be all to-dos, and it'll say get all to-dos. And then you can provide additional information here if it's particularly advanced. We're going to keep it kind of simple for this one here, though. So yeah, we're going to come down to the collection and make sure we select to-dos full stack, and we're going to save it in there. And when you start having more and more of these, you can have multiple subfolders as well. As an example here from my Catstagram demo I did with some of my students in webinar. It's an Instagram clone that's meant specifically for cats, which is what Instagram almost does anyway. Anyway, we have our own folder that can make subfolders, and we're going to start saving our tasks in there, our requests in there. Why do I want to do that? Well, let's say, again, I send this to a developer buddy or someone else on my team, or I had to reinstall Postman, which I've done before, and you've lost all of your, and you've lost all the tabs you have been not saving and keeping up here and open in like 30 at a time. So if I have no tabs open and I'm like, what was my all to-dos endpoint again? Boom. You can repopulate that really fast, and you have a description of what it does for other people, almost like you're kind of documenting your paths as you go. Because I know in my last video series, I left comments above these routers for so we can track their paths, but I think we're a little bit beyond that at this point. But by all means, feel free to keep leaving comments in your files here about what the full path is to hit this endpoint. But we're going to be using Postman to essentially document that for us anyway. Okay. Now that that's wired up, something else I typically like to do as well is a lot of my code here will eventually be talking to a database, so I'll go ahead and set up almost like a template of sorts. It'll contain a try-catch block. I'll typically log what my error is so I know what's going on, and then I'm going to go ahead and set up some kind of status code 500 and send a JSON message of some kind of message that tells us that we need to check our console logs. And if you want to be clever, you can also just go ahead and include the error in the response itself, so you don't have to jump from Postman into your logs. This should just log what the error is. And if you don't care about seeing massive errors, you can even just choose to send the error message along with our response right there. And we can test this out by doing the following. We'll have a res.json that says all to-dos in case we actually have them, but we're actually going to say throw a new error that says whoopsie, and that's it. So we are, our res.json's already unhighlighted right there because it's never going to get there, but let's see what it ends up looking like here in the browser. So, I closed the tab out, no worries, we can just open it up right away. And there you go. So we get our catch block caught that error, logged just a generic my code sucks message. I always like being self-deprecating in that regard, and when I make sites for my friends and they get internal server errors, they end up DMing me going, hey, your code sucks, your error told me to let you know, and I think it's just kind of funny. And then it's going to log what the error message is if you messed up your SQL or some kind of promise chain failed or something like that. It's just good to have that error message here in Postman so you wouldn't have to come down here and look at your console log. This will be like the verbose version if you need it, that whoopsie error and where it came from. And this will be just the message itself that you can maybe quickly look at and go, oh, I messed up something in my SQL syntax. Happens all the time. Okay, so that's a good little thing to do right there. We're not actually going to throw that in. We're going to get rid of that. I just want to show you all how the catch block can actually do its job there. And yeah, we're going to kind of use this as a template for all of our other routers, right? So there are ways to do global error handling where we can actually just write something that looks akin to the following. We can just write next error. But again, this web series is more for covering a lot of the fundamentals and why we're writing them, and not all the advanced tricks, because the advanced tricks are obviously much easier to figure out when you have some solid core skills to work from. So there is a way we can global error handle our entire application, but nah, we ain't gonna do that this time around. Okay, we got our first little endpoint set up, and a lot of the times I go ahead and scaffold out all of the CRUD operations, because again, that's just a good place to start. So this is going to be our get all, this is going to be our get one request. So this will say I'm going to provide a particular post ID. Now in TypeScript and in vanilla JavaScript, you don't know this, but in TypeScript as well, obviously, these parameters, no matter what, so check this out. I'm going to make a holding variable for this. rect.params.postID. This data type, even if you do something like /1, is always going to be a string. We have to account for that and make sure that if our functions are expecting numbers, that we cast this from a string to a number. And we can simply just take that parameter and change it into a number like that if we so desire. So I'll say there we go. And that way, why did I call it post ID? Come on, Luke. This is the to-do ID. There we go. That way we can get the to-do ID of whatever we're trying to get right there. So we're going to get our to-do ID of one particular to-do item, and that should send the singular to-do items task for like a details page or something like that. And we cast this to a number just to make sure that we know that these things are always strings no matter what. And if our query function is expecting the ID as a number, that we're all in line for TypeScript. It's just a common thing to be aware of on these endpoints. So I'm going to make a new tab. It's going to be to localhost 3000 API/todos /1 or 2 or just 1, 2, 3 as an example. Does it work? It sure does. It grabbed that information for us, no problem. Now that I know that's set up, I'm going to go ahead and say to do by ID or something like that for this request, and it should automatically be set up to save in there. And there you go. All right, get all to do's, get to do by ID. I kind of let these things read out the way I like them to read out. I like them to be intuitive. Okay, now that that's set up, let's go ahead and set up our other CRUD routers as well. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this next one. This will be a post request, so API, post API to do's, and we're going to be expecting some kind of request body. We're going to figure out what that is later. We're going to say const new to do equals the rec.body, and so we're going to say added new to do, and I'm simply going to say maybe send that rec body back to me, which will also tell me if I set up my express.json correctly or if I get undefined. That way, if we forgot our server TS's express.json, this will tell us very quickly if we'll get undefined. Okay, so new tabarino, drop down post, localhost 3000, /API /todos is expecting a JSON body. So we're going to head into the body tab. Oh, this zoom in is going to kill me. I'm going to collapse that collection window here. Oh, it's not happening. It's not going to be like, nah, dog, I ain't doing that. There we go. All right, so raw JSON. And, the database will probably handle the ID and the timestamp. So I need to have, this will make sense when we get into the database. I'm going to go ahead and just do some pre-stuff here. We're going to say our user ID for this information is going to be 1. And the content of this to-do item or the task itself or what should we call it? Well, we're just making it up for now. It could be changed later. Record demo in today's task. So we're going to click send. And because I see my message here and the copy of the request body, I know that express JSON is set up and my tab is kind of set up and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and save this one. Say post new to do. There we go, save. That way I have that on save and ready to go. Next up is our put tab. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to go back up here and copy this get one request because the put is kind of like a copy of the get one and the post, right? It's going to be editing this particular ID, and we're going to pass in, just like in our post, a rec body that contains the corrections, the typo fixes, the change ups on that task. I'm going to call that the edited to do item. Cool. And that way I can do the same thing. Send that edited to do back at me. And again, this response could change when we start actually adding the database in the next series of videos here, but we're just setting up the basics of the CRUD routes essentially, and that's really all we're doing. So I'm actually going to copy this one right away and go ahead and crank out the delete portion as well. And we don't need a rect body on our delete function or method. Endpoint, all we need to do is provide which one we're deleting. So we're going to say deleted or destroyed. Destroyed sounds way cooler, so we're going to do that. Destroy that particular to-do item. And that way, look at that. We already have our CRUD routes set up for when we finally connect to a database, so we don't have to worry about routing, which tends to be some people's concern. So we're going to just crank that out of the way, really. A new tab. We're going to do our put request. It's going to be to the path of localhost 3000 /API/to-do/generic123. We're going to go ahead and echo back to ourselves that JSON body. I'm going to copy the same one I already have in my post tab because it's going to be probably kind of similar looking. We could possibly edit the task, or probably not who wrote the task, so just user ID and whether it's completed or not. But yeah, cool. Go ahead and fire that away. Yeah, the response echoes back to us exactly what I'm expecting, my message with the correct ID and my rect body being sent back to myself so I know it's set up correctly. So save, put, edit, task. Am I calling them task or to-dos? I need to be consistent here, otherwise this is going to turn into a catastrophe. So we're gonna check that out. New to-do by ID. I don't know why I called it task. This is the reason the to-dos is so difficult for me, because I always forget what I called it. Okay, all right. And for some reason I decided to full case some things, not others. All right, just trying to be consistent here, y'all. That's it. So got that edited. We're going to go ahead and make sure that's edited and saved. We're good to go. And then finally, I'm actually going to copy this path here and open up a new tab, drop down, delete. And we're going to delete that path right there. Click a send to Reno, and we got it. That's the response I'm expecting. I'm going to save that. Be delete a to-do by ID. And that way in my collection, these things, again, just kind of read and make sense to me. Put edit to-do at ID, delete it to-do at ID, post. And there you go. I like how that one has A in it. Man, this consistency thing. Curse you, consistency that I try and advocate for, then don't do myself. But there you go. It's as simple as that to use a collection to save. And now, again, we could export this thing to send to our teammates if we wanted to, if we are the server developer and you want to send this to your client side guys or gals so they can open up their own Postman window and test the endpoints you're writing here to make sure your server's working. That's something I wish I had as a student that I didn't know about. But now check it out. We have our routes ready to test with when we get there. We have our CRUD operations set up, and we can add whatever new routes we need to as we move forward. I think that's going to be enough for this video, just setting up the basic setting of our routes. In the next video series, we're actually going to dive into how to set up a database connection inside of our server folder, and I'll see y'all there.